do begin with the breaking news that Martin mentioned tonight out of Jackson, Georgia. Troy Davis was scheduled for the fourth time to be executed at 7 p.m. Eastern tonight. But at this hour, Troy Davis is still alive. The state of Georgia temporarily delayed his execution while the United States Supreme Court considers tonight whether to review a request for a stay of execution. Troy Davis was convicted of killing off-duty police officer Mark McPhail in August 1989. Mr. Davis sentenced to death after a trial in 1991. But since that trial, 7 of the 9 witnesses who claim to have seen Troy Davis shoot Officer McPhail have recanted their testimony. 7 of the 9. 3 of the jurors in the case now say they would not have voted to convict him if they knew then what they know now. President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict, Desmond Tutu are among the figures calling for clemency for Troy Davis. But the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles declined the calls for clemency, and today the Georgia Supreme Court denied a stay of execution. But again, at this hour, despite a 7 p.m. execution hour tonight, Troy Davis is still alive. His execution on a temporary hold while the United States Supreme Court decides whether or not to consider the request for a stay of execution. Joining us now is NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, thanks very much for joining us tonight. What can you tell us about what is expected from the Supreme Court?
Well, what's expected is an answer to the question, will you grant the stay or not? It's a simple question, and it will get a very simple response whenever the court is ready to do it. It's been about 3 hours now since the lawyers for Troy Davis filed their emergency request with the Supreme Court asking for a stay of execution. What this basically means is the lawyers are telling the Supreme Court, look, we intend to appeal the case, but until we do, would you please put a hold on the execution while all of that is in process? It's not an unusual request in these death penalty cases, although it does come very close to the time for execution. There is no time limit here, but what's clearly happened is that the Georgia officials, although they had every legal right to proceed with the execution, have decided to put it on hold. Or to put it another way, there's no legal impediment to Georgia proceeding with the execution, but they're waiting to see what the Supreme Court says. If the Supreme Court says there's a stay on the execution, then it's off. There'll have to be a new execution date set, depending on what the Supreme Court decides to do with the appeal. But if the Supreme Court denies the stay, then the state could go ahead. We went into a similar situation last week in Texas, Rachel, with a death penalty case with just the Supreme Court ultimately did grant a stay of execution, and it came 2 hours after the scheduled execution time. So, the court does this when it's ready, and we just don't know when that'll come. I would think, though, that it would be tonight.
This is the 4th time that Troy Davis has had an execution date set, as you know, Pete. Based on what we know about the case up until this point, what we know would have been the basis for the request for the stay from Troy Davis's lawyers tonight, are you able to make an even educated guess as to what the Supreme Court might ultimately decide based on how they have considered this case in the past?
No, because, it's the court did have this case last time, sent it back to the lower courts, and they have to decide whether, in their opinion, the lower courts did what the Supreme Court wanted them to do. Did they adequately address the issues that the court sent back to them? Did they get their homework done is the question. Now, part of the problem here, Rachel, is that the lawyers for Troy Davis have filed papers at the Supreme Court. The state has responded. That's a total of 4 pages between the two parties. There isn't much to chew on for the Supreme Court here. Normally, when you seek a stay of execution, you've separately filed the reasons why you think the court should take the case, the guts of the appeal. That hasn't been filed with the court yet. So there's not a lot for the court to consider at this point, at this hour. So it puts the court in a very difficult position. They have to try to look back at the lower court record to see what some of the issues are. It's a very, very difficult question. It's not an unusual one for the Supreme Court. It's not an unfamiliar one, I guess I should say, because this does happen from time to time, and there's a whole mechanism at the Supreme Court for handling these emergency appeals. There are people in the clerk's office who do nothing but this. But it's a difficult thing because the court doesn't have the benefit of the regular kind of appeal that you would file. It's just a very bare, please give us a stay.
While the state of Georgia is still awaiting word one way or the other from the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, Pete, there's no legal impediment to them going ahead with the execution. They could decide to do that at any point. When states have this sort of interaction with the Supreme Court over an execution like this, is it generally accepted practice that they do wait for the Supreme Court, that they do not make a decision to go ahead on their own when there could be, at the last moment, some word from the Supremes?
I think the best answer is some do and some don't. We've had cases where executions go ahead, even though there is a stay of execution request pending before the Supreme Court. We've had cases like this one, like the one in Texas last week, where the state waits out of deference and to make sure that all the legal avenues are, in fact, exhausted. So it's really a matter for the states. Obviously, Texas does a lot of executions. It has the record of the most in the nation, and they do wait. That has been their pattern. I'm not familiar enough with the execution system in Georgia to know whether they have a habit of waiting or not. But I would think, again, that the Supreme Court is well aware of what's going on that you see in those pictures right now of all those people waiting. They know that there's a whole mechanism going on down there in Georgia. There's people waiting. There's family members waiting on both sides. They know that, and my sense is they'll try to get this done as quickly as they can. But it is a very serious question, and that's why they're not rushing.
NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams, who has been on this story for us tonight at great length. Pete, thank you very much for staying with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Sure.